Chanelle Dennis is an accredited cognitive behavioral psychotherapist and trainee clinical psychologist. She's passionate about raising mental health awareness and reducing the stigma around it, especially in the Black and brown communities. Chanelle, I'm so happy that you're here with me this morning. How are you today?
Thank you for having me. I'm great, thank you.
Awesome. And I was really excited to have you on the show today, dealing with Mental Health Awareness Week, and we're focusing on the idea of loneliness. And you're somebody who's studied the way the mind works, psychology, and it's really interesting to get a perspective from the medical world, but also from a Christian in the medical world as well. So before we go into that kind of detail, tell me what inspired you to begin your journey into becoming a therapist, and what motivates you to support people in that way?
I think my own personal experience actually motivated me to kind of get interested in the psychology world. I experienced the loss of my twin sister when I was 9 years old, and that was really difficult for me. And at the time, I don't really think mental health and, therapy was seen as a thing that Black people do or Black people go to, especially when you're a Christian. And as I started to grow up and learn more about psychology and sociology and realize actually there's services out there that can help people who are experiencing difficult, feelings, I thought, yeah, this is what I want to do. This is something that I'm really passionate about and that I'm really interested in. So I've started since I was 18. I did my bachelor's in psychology, and then I did 2 postgraduates in cognitive behavioral psychotherapy, and now I'm doing my doctorate in clinical psychology. So what motivates me is the return that you get. I think it's amazing when you see someone's recovery. When you see someone starting at A, which may be feeling like very down, very depressed, feeling unmotivated at the end of wanting to live. And then you get them to a point, or you support them to a point, because it's a lot of the individual doing the work, where they're motivated to live, they're passionate about life again. And I think that's the best part about it, seeing the actual transformation in someone's life.
That's amazing. And I'm really intrigued to know about you mentioned your personal experience, where I think you probably experienced a extreme form of loneliness, I guess, where you've been brought up with somebody who's extremely close to you, very, very close to you, and taken away. What's that like? What was that like? And how have you dealt with it up until this point of your life?
Yeah, definitely. Like, I was a identical twin sister. So identical twins, they're born from one egg, one ovary, and they split. So all I've ever known is like togetherness. Mm-hmm. And then obviously lived my life for like 9 years with my twin sister. We used to dress alike. We used to go to the same school, same class. We did everything together. So it was really difficult suddenly losing her, and it was in such a very sudden and unexpected way. It wasn't like an illness. We weren't expecting it. Just one Friday afternoon, and she was gone. So it was a really difficult time, and I don't think anyone really understood what it felt like, because I was the only twin in the family. So no one really could imagine how it felt and how lonely I was feeling. But yeah, it was a really difficult time. So loneliness is a very adequate theme for this week. I think I can talk about it a lot.
Yeah. So you've gone on to do all this studying and qualify yourself in so many different degrees and stuff. Now in your day-to-day role, just talk me through your day-to-day work day. What's it like on a day-to-day basis?
Okay, so it varies a little bit. Because I'm a trainee clinical psychologist, I go on different placements. So I'm currently on my CAMS placement, which is Children and Adolescents Mental Health. And I've been there for about 4 weeks now, so I'm still very, very new to it. And this is actually my first time working directly with children. I've worked with children in different roles before, but this is the first time being in a specific service for children and young people. Mm-hmm. Day to day, I do therapy appointments. So that may start off with an assessment appointment to determine suitability for the service, or even the needs of the client and what they may need from therapy sessions, or from any other professionals that may be in the service. Because it's not always psychology or therapy. Sometimes it might be seeing a psychiatrist and needing some medication. Sometimes it might be seeing a nurse or an occupational therapist. So it could be different professions that are needed. So I'll do an assessment. If they are taken on for therapy sessions, then we'll have one-to-one therapy sessions, which normally last about 50 minutes, sometimes a little bit longer. Often with kids a little less, so about 30 to 40 minutes, just so that they can sit through the appointment. And then I do supervision. So I supervise assistant psychologists or other members of staff. Basically in psychology or any kind of mental health problems that they may be working with. I also do reflective practice groups, So reflective practice groups are for professionals who aren't from a psychology or mental health background, but are maybe working in that field and kind of need that space to debrief and think about the work that they're doing. And maybe some helpful advice about what they could be doing that may be more helpful for the person that they're working with or the group that they're working with. I do groups every so often. It's quite varied, actually. I do a lot. I also do, more so now that I'm a trainee clinical psychologist, I look at service evaluations, think about how we can do improvements to the service, and a little bit more leadership than I did in my previous role. So quite varied. Every day is definitely different.
That's good. I guess it means there's something interesting every day.
Yes.
So
yes,
you've been there for a few years now. You've obviously worked in lots of different kind of fields in that one major field you're in. What are some of the common kind of misconceptions around loneliness and mental health that you come across?
Well, I think with loneliness in particular, I think often people think that it's the people who have no family and have no friends particularly who are going to be more lonely than others. But actually loneliness can affect anyone. You can be from a massive family or have lots of friends or have a big social circle, but still feel quite lonely. Because loneliness is about the quality and the depth of relationships rather than the quantity. So that's the first misconception. I think people often think that, oh, she's not lonely, she's got lots of friends, or he's not lonely, he's from a massive family. But we never know actually what people are actually experiencing. And I think people don't often realise how much loneliness can affect our mental health. So when people are suffering from long-term loneliness in particular, there's an increase of cortisol, which is a stress hormone. Okay. So that's what causes us to feel stress. So that means that we're more prone and more likely to develop ongoing problems with mental health if we are experiencing loneliness for long periods of time. So there's a very close association. But to be lonely doesn't mean necessarily having a mental health problem. And having a mental health problem doesn't necessarily mean loneliness, but they often come together.
So we talked earlier about your experience of loneliness and growing up as a twin and having lost your twin at a young age. What experiences have you had in later life of loneliness and how have you overcome them?
Well, I think everyone experienced loneliness during the pandemic and COVID. I live alone, and if you remember in the beginning of the pandemic, there were very, very, very strict guidelines about not mixing with other households. And I think it probably came a few weeks into the pandemic, or maybe a little bit longer, but I may have broke the rules or not, where you could begin to do bubble mixing and you could mix with another household. So during that time, I think that was a significant feeling of loneliness. I don't think I necessarily realised at the time, but looking back, because I am quite a social and active person, suddenly not being able to do that was quite difficult. And I think what helped is definitely utilising social media and technology and Zoom and Teams and all of those other different technologies that became popular during the pandemic. And I think being intentional with reaching out and connecting with people and not just thinking, oh, everyone's experiencing the same thing and everyone's going through the same thing, because actually different people had different experiences during the pandemic. But being intentional, actually, I'm going to phone this friend today, or I'm going to FaceTime this family member today, and being intentional with actually socialising, but online. So I think that was a massive thing that helped. And being honest, I think sometimes we feel like we don't want to share how we're feeling or be honest, oh, I'm feeling a bit lonely. But having that trusted someone, if you do have someone, is really helpful. And I think for me, talking to my friends about it, who were also going through similar situations, was very helpful in helping me to overcome.
That's great, yeah. And I think lockdown was an eye-opener for a lot of people, because we often kind of prescribe mental health issues to those who are on the extreme levels of mental health. So people who've been diagnosed with specific conditions and that kind of thing. Whereas I think all of us at one point or another during lockdown and during the last couple of years have had to face our own kind of mental health, I won't say mortality, but our own mental health condition, because suddenly being alone and isolated, and there's lots of fear and all that happening around us. I think a lot of people had to think about things they'd never thought about before. A lot of people who've been on almost on autopilot in their life suddenly had to stop, and there's things that were the normal in their life were unnormalized, if that makes sense. So I think it's been a really challenging time. I guess that leads on to the next point, really, which is in a community where kind of mental health is stigmatized. What do you do? How do you tackle loneliness? Where if you look at the Black and brown community, even the church community, where mental health can sometimes be considered as something that is not a real thing. Come on, man up, fix up. You can do better than that. Pray about it. God's got you back. All this kind of stuff. How do we tackle the loneliness and even mental health issues in an environment where it's still kind of a stigma around it?
Yeah, I think you kind of touched on it yourself there, and I think probably the most important thing is to not make assumptions, because I mentioned earlier sometimes we can make assumptions based on people's kind of social network that you see around them. But that doesn't mean that person isn't lonely. And I think sometimes we can miss a lot of people assuming that person is fine, that person is okay because they have certain people around them, when actually they may be the ones struggling the most. So I think that will be the first thing, not to make assumptions about who's experiencing loneliness and who's experiencing mental health problems as well, because we don't know. Mm-hmm. It's different from like a physical health problem. If you've got a broken arm, you can visibly tell that someone's got a broken arm. Or, if you're feeling you've got a cold, there might be like having a sniffly nose and coughing, so you can visibly tell. Mm-hmm. But someone experiencing a mental health problem or experiencing loneliness, you can't tell. You can't tell what's going on behind the mask. So I think never make assumptions. Mm-hmm. I think be intentional as well with the people that you are connecting with, especially in like church communities. I think sometimes we can have certain friends and certain people that we speak to every week when we go to Bible study or when we go to Sunday service or whenever you choose to worship. But there's other people who are maybe more quieter in the background who sometimes get missed. Mm-hmm. And I think if you can be intentional about speaking to someone new each week or every time you visit church, that would be a great way in really reaching those people who sometimes get missed and sometimes leave as a result of that because I feel like they're not, being fellowshipped with and they're not being connected with. Mm-hmm. In regards to mental health as well, I think sometimes people expect depression or expect anxiety to look a certain way. I guess when we think about depression, we think about sadness and maybe feeling tearful and upset. Mm-hmm. But depression can affect people in different ways and anxiety can affect people in different ways. So again, I would say not to make assumptions about how someone is experiencing a mental health issue because it might be different for each person. And we really need to just talk and ask that person, what is going on for you? What do you need? And how can I help?
That's some great advice. And I want to get you to give me a bit more advice now. And for everyone who's listening as well, because we've got people all over the world listening right now. And I can guarantee out of all those people listening, there's somebody who's looking at a new life of loneliness suddenly from either loss of in their life or a change in their circumstances. And there's also people listening who are dealing with long-term loneliness, so maybe separated from family, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. What kind of advice would you give to those people who are experiencing either long-term loneliness or who are just kind of realizing they're alone? What advice would you give to those people?
Yeah. Well, firstly, I want to acknowledge that it must be really hard. Loneliness is, a difficult thing to experience. And like we know, it can impact in people's mental health. So I really do appreciate how hard it can be to experience loneliness and to suddenly be alone out unexpectedly. And I think, like you said, bereavement can be one of those experiences, or divorce, or, the loss or end of a relationship. Mm-hmm. So what I would encourage people to do is to slowly start to think about ways that they can reconnect. And I feel like sometimes this can feel like a really difficult thing for people. It may be easier for some who are more naturally maybe outgoing and extroverted, but think about different networks that are available or groups that are available in your community. Mm-hmm. So it could be your local church or other churches or other kind of places of worship. Sometimes they do coffee mornings. Sometimes they do, Bible teaching, Bible studying. Go to a Bible study group, even if that's not something that you're interested in. Reach out to go to different sports clubs with different sports groups. Think about creating or starting a new hobby. And think about online organisations as well. There's a few called like Meetup, Bumble, befriending.co.uk. So sometimes it actually takes you taking the first step.
Yeah.
You taking the first step and deciding that actually, I'm feeling lonely. I know that people aren't necessarily going to knock on my door and say, hey, you're lonely, I'm going to help. So what can I do to make the first move? But I would say if you have been experiencing loneliness for a long time, don't suddenly sign up to every single group and activity that's out there, because that can be quite overwhelming and tiring in itself, and that can lead to burnout, and that person might then think, actually, forget it, I'm not going to do anything. So start slow. It might be that you just sign up for one thing and you go once and you think, actually, I like this, I can do it again. And then you go again, and then you go again, and then you go again. That's
really good, really good advice. And I think touching on the Black and brown community in a bit more detail, then in the community where there is the stigma and where it's kind of this, all this stuff is new to us, talking about our mental health, how we feel, our emotions. I would ask you from a professional perspective, and maybe even from a personal perspective, like, what are your hopes for our communities as we try to kind of go into this world now of acknowledging mental health as a real thing, talking about it, being present and being open about it. And how would you like to see our growth in that area? What would you want to see for us to progress?
Well, firstly, I want to say that actually I'm quite happy with the progress that we have made in recent years, especially like the last few years. I think there has been quite a massive increase in the fact that we're willing to have the conversations, that we're being more open and honest about mental health issues, that churches and places of worship are talking more about it. I think before, especially in Black and brown communities, we didn't talk about it. It's definitely a thing that was kept behind closed doors, was prayed away, was fasted away. And it's not to say that you shouldn't pray and fast, but sometimes there's other things that are needed as well for that person too. So I think that in the recent years, we've made massive, massive improvements. And I think just thinking about clinical psychology, the profession that I'm training in at the moment, 4 or 5 years ago, there was one Black person in the whole of the UK that was recruited for the programme, which is NHS funded. Now, this cohort, like 4 people alone have been recruited for my programme for the next cohort. So that's brilliant. Like 1 year, one person for the whole of England 5 years ago, 4 people for one programme 5 years later. So I think we're making improvements, but progress could always be better and always be quicker. And I think just being open and honest, I think it takes a few brave people wanting to be like, okay, I've experienced mental health problems, this is my difficulty. And it helps to break the stigma, because we still feel a bit like we can't talk, we can't share. But it just takes one person first sharing their story, and the other person feels a bit more comfortable to do so too. And then eventually we start to build communities where mental health is spoken about, quite openly and quite easily, without that shame or that fear attached. So I would encourage anyone, from Black and brown communities, from, church background, be open to people who may be experiencing a mental health problem. Yes, let's continue to pray for these people, but let's encourage them to seek support from professionals, from people who can help, from people who are trained to deal with mental health issues specifically.
That's really good. One of the things I really enjoy about you is your social media and how you give so many practical tips and bits of advice using your pointy reels and all that kind of stuff. It's really cool. I've never haven't mastered TikTok and all that kind of stuff yet, and reels. But what I'd love you to share now is just a few tips that you give to all of our listeners who are kind of dealing with different levels of loneliness and dealing with ways to reduce how they feel. You've given so many good tips already, and you've given some really cool places to go and find, like Meetup and Bumble and a few others. But is there maybe choose your 3 top tips that you give to anybody trying to deal with loneliness or reduce loneliness? What can they do starting from today? I'm listening to you right now, Chanelle, Dr. Chanelle, as I'm going to call you. And I want you to give me 3 things. When I finish listening to this, I can go and do straight away. What would you advise me to do right away?
I think the first thing would be to stop. Stop, take a moment, observe, and prepare. It's kind of like an acronym, you can remember it by. And Because sometimes we can be going through the motions of life and not actually realizing how we are feeling, and that actually, you know what, for the last 2 weeks I have felt really down. I have been avoiding people and I haven't been going out and I have been cancelling social events. What is that actually about? Or, you know what, I am feeling really anxious about going out all of a sudden, and that means that I'm not doing the things that I used to enjoy anymore. And sometimes the busyness of life can mean that things creep up on us without us necessarily realizing. So the first thing I would say is stop and just take a moment to really check in with yourself. Really check in with how you're feeling emotionally, physically, spiritually, psychologically, and take a moment to think, actually, this is an area that you may be struggling in, thinking, okay, if this is an area that I'm struggling in, what can I do about it? Second thing I would say is self-care. And I think self-care is a thing that's thrown around a lot these days. And self-care sometimes to people means, oh, I'm going to have a bubble bath and do a face mask. And I love those things, but that's not the only thing that self-care includes. Self-care is so much more than that. Self-care might mean having a really difficult conversation with someone that you've been putting off for months and months. Self-care might mean putting in boundaries so that you're not overwhelmed and overworked and resentful. Self-care might mean, actually, I need to go seek some professional help or some professional support. Self-care can mean lots of different things for different people. So really take a moment to think, actually, am I taking care of myself? As well as physically. Do I need a bubble bath? Do I need to go have a spa or massage? Those things are important too, but it's not the only thing to think about when we're thinking about self-care. And the last thing I would say, because you said free, and I could go on forever, is be compassionate. Compassionate to yourself and compassionate to others, because you just don't know what other people are going through. And sometimes, we've said it already throughout this conversation, we can make assumptions about people's experiences and what's going on for them. But actually, there could be a whole different story going on behind the mask. So be compassionate to yourself and to others.
I love that. So you basically said we need to stop and evaluate what we're doing. Let's see, is this really the path we want to be on? Then you talked about self-care, which we often kind of prescribe as just things that affect our outer body. So baths, that kind of stuff, and bubbles and candles and all that kind of stuff.
Which are great.
It's great, but also having that difficult conversation with ourselves and say, well, like, what's going on in my life right now that shouldn't be happening? Who do I need to talk to about things that have been done to me that I need to address or that I've experienced? And I guess finally, the most important one I think really is be compassionate to yourself and to others. And I say most importantly, in my opinion, because it's like sometimes we're so hard on ourselves, we forget where we've come from, we forget the experiences we've had, and we kind of look at ourselves as the unfinished products, but we forget to actually count where we started from. We may not be where we want to be, but like considering where we came from, we've done so great, and it's really important to just have some mercy and grace for yourself in the same way that we should have that for others too. This has been an absolutely fantastic conversation, Chanelle, and I'm really hoping that everyone listening has taken something from it, even if it's just the last 3 practical points. I definitely want to get you back on soon to talk about more about your experiences and some of the things that you've been through and experienced that have made you who you are today. But thank you for giving me some of your time on a Sunday morning. I know you're going to church this morning as well.
I am.
So
I am.
Have a great service. Thank you for being here today. And for those of you who want to find Chanelle, you can find her on social media. We'll share all the links with you. But she's on Chanelle. She's on social media as Chanelle Rose. Do you want to spell it out for me, Chanelle?
Yeah, it's Chanelle __ Rose. So that's CHANELLE_Rose ROSE.
And she's got great tips.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. She's got great tips for you on social media, so make sure you follow and like her stuff as well.